Hello, middle school students. We would like to welcome you to the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum's webinar for our Race Ed and Conscious Curriculum and Conversations projects for our middle school students. My name is Heather Williams, and I'm the Program Director here at SACAM. During this webinar, we ask that you please type any questions you may have about today's discussion in the Q&A area of the Zoom call. And your questions will be presented to the panelists as soon as we can. The Conscious Curriculum and Conversation webinar is the brainchild of two students who currently attend Lady Bird Johnson High School right here in San Antonio, Texas. These bright students saw a need to educate fellow students of all levels to assist them in coping with the racial and social impacts of what they observed because of racism and prejudices. They reached out to us at the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum for guidance and support. We were thrilled to help them in their endeavor. After careful thought, consideration, research, and community feedback, the project began to take shape, and the Race Ed Conscious Curriculum and Conversations was born, brought to you by SACAM and Google Fiber. We are currently really glad that you chose to join us for this month's topic, which is called Diasporic Education. Without further ado, I am proud to present to you our Race Ed hosts, Avery Neal and Abived Pulapaka. We welcome you, Avery and Abived. Why don't you go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelists tonight?
Sure. So today we have Dr. Sunita Punjabi joining us. She is the founder of the Brain Science Symposium for the city of San Antonio. Dr. Punjabi is also known as the Brain Coach, currently practicing in the medical center where she is doing research and assisting people to create a cause-driven life. Dr. Sunita uses neurointegration technology and psychology to help individuals experience mental transformations that can be measured at the neurological level. Thank you.
We also have Dr. Charles Gentry with us tonight, who is a versatile educator and consultant for local artists, community organizations, and small businesses. He has taught high school and college level arts, culture, and computer application courses, and was a curator and theater manager at the Flint Institute of Arts in Michigan. A San Antonio native, Charles also enjoys being actively involved as a certified tourism ambassador, World Heritage ambassador, high school lacrosse coach, and community volunteer. Thank you, Dr. Gentry. If we could now have a topic introduction.
Thank you, Abby and Avery, for the introductions and for your bravery and courage in starting these conscious conversations. It's been a pleasure to participate in these conversations, and I'm happy to share my screen now to just give an introduction to the topic of diasporic education. And we're going to focus on a couple of ways of looking at diaspora. We'll talk about the definition of the term diaspora, and as well as some of the traditions that come along with diasporic populations when they arrive in new places and in new locations. And so just to begin with the definition of diaspora, let's advance. We've got some related key terms such as birthplace and migration, which includes birthplace as the ground on which a group adopted a common social title and classification. You can find an exploration of these terms on the Conscious Curriculum website at sacam.org, and follow along with some of these key terms and also some of the activities that are available on the website. To immigrate, immigrate, is to come into a nation or settlement. To emigrate is to outmigrate, so to speak, and that's to leave one's nation or settlement, perhaps to seek asylum elsewhere. And then with homeland and identity, we can think of a cultural identity as how you and others who share characteristics to you see yourselves. And so that could be a common language, an ancestral homeland, or other common cultural markers that you share as part of your identity. And then finally, a term that is worth considering as well is the idea of exile. And this would be a prolonged separation from a nation or homeland as by force of circumstances. And so you could imagine war being one type of circumstance, or as we are witnessing in this very tumultuous year, a coronavirus pandemic has led people to flee dangerous locations to seek shelter or asylum elsewhere. So these are some of the terms that we want to think about when we think about diaspora. And when we look at the global diasporic movements, we see these arrows connecting some of the different places where people are migrating from and to. We're not going to focus on all of these movements, but I did want to call your attention to just a couple of them. We have, the North American continent, the New World, where lots of folks arrived in the 14 to 1500s and into the 1600s. And you would have those populations coming from Western Europe. And oftentimes they would come by way of Africa, bringing the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade with them to the Caribbean and to the Americas. You've got a diasporic population migrating between the Americas, from the Caribbean to North America, or from South America to the north. You've also got your Russian Jewish diaspora that originates in Russia, goes through the Middle East, perhaps Israel, and then may make its way either to Europe or by way of other continents to North America. And then another diaspora that we will look at today is the Indian subcontinent. And so you can see populations moving to and from the European, Western Europe continent, mostly in the UK, to Africa or to Asia, and then to the Americas. And so lots of arrows going back and forth. But this is one way of to think about diasporic movements. A lot of those arrows go back and forth because people do travel back and forth between their homeland and a chosen land. And so when we talk about the definition of the term diaspora, we define it as the movement, migration, or scattering of people away from an established or ancestral homeland. And people who make up that diaspora may be settled far from their ancestral homelands, and then the place where these people live. So you may have a diasporic community, let's say in San Antonio or Houston or Dallas, who may have a shared cultural connection to a faraway place, and may even have people who travel back and forth between those places and that diasporic community here in the United States, as an example. Other learning objectives, we'll talk about some of these key terms as they relate to diaspora and why understanding diaspora communities is important. And then finally, we'll identify some ways that holiday traditions can contribute to a better understanding of diaspora. And if you were able to visit the SACAM website in advance of the session, then you were able to see that we had some activities related to holiday traditions around the world. And on today, the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, the shortest day of the year, or the longest night of the year, depending on how you look at it, we might think about why we have a lot of lighting traditions in this time of the year. And there was an interesting article published in the New York Times today that made me think more about this, and it relates directly to our conversation today. So I just wanted to mention that to you, that we've got these lighting traditions around this time of year because it is the darkest day of the year with the solstice. And so for millennia, during these months of darkness, humans have turned to rituals and stories to remind one another of hope and deeper truths. I'm quoting directly from the New York Times article. And they say, all over the world, celebrations of light dot the winter darkness like stars. Hindus, Jains, and Sikhs celebrate Diwali, a 5-day festival of light, victory over darkness. December in the Christian calendar, of course, marks the season of Advent, or waiting for the salvation in the birth of Jesus. And since ancient times, humans have created rituals to imitate a desired outcome. So one of the oldest such practices is the act of lighting a fire to call back the sun. So we could think about candle lighting in this way of bringing light into darkness. And these traditions are shared amongst different communities, but they travel when they leave a homeland and arrive in a new location where that community puts down new roots. And so we have Diwali celebrations, not only in the Indian subcontinent, but here in the United States as well. So I'll leave it there, and we'll start to explore these questions about diaspora a little more deeply now.
Alrighty, thank you, Dr. Gentry. So to begin, we have a question for both you and Dr. Punjabi, is how can a diaspora feel less separated from their heritage or homeland? Are there certain practices or activities that can help bridge this type of gap?
Dr. Gentry, would you like to take that first?
Sure, I'd be happy to take on that question. And one way that we have communities that come together and celebrate or find unity in the diaspora is through these cultural traditions. And so it doesn't just have to be during this dark holiday season. It can be year round that people have their cultural traditions that they come together and practice. And if I go back to the examples that I provided in the slide, I'll just share my screen one more time and go back to those images. So we had Hanukkah in one image, and that's the lighting of the candles. We just made it through the 8 days of Hanukkah. And you also have Kwanzaa. And so people may think of these traditions as being different because Hanukkah is an ancient tradition. Kwanzaa is a more recently developed tradition invented by Maulana Karenga in the 1970s in America for African Americans to celebrate their cultural heritage and connections to African traditions and practices. And so in some ways, that practice of adopting a new tradition is one way to build community in oppressive circumstances or difficult political situations where you might not feel like you can connect to the dominant culture or the dominant traditions. Now, of course, not all African Americans feel like they don't have a connection to holidays like Hanukkah. There are African Americans who are Jewish and who celebrate Hanukkah. And of course, the predominant religion practiced by African Americans in the United States is Christianity. And so, of course, most African Americans celebrate Christmas as well. But you have many families, like my own, that might also celebrate Kwanzaa. And it's a way to celebrate a very unique and specific cultural identity. After Christmas is over, we celebrate key principles like unity and family and shared resources and things like that in the days following Christmas. And that's another way in which displaced peoples or communities who might feel like they're marginalized can come together and even invent traditions or cultural practices to celebrate their unity and connectedness. And I'll leave it to Dr. Punjabi to perhaps add to other ideas about ways in which people come together in diaspora communities.
I think something as simple as looking at your family tree, and today there's so many great ways to look at your ethnicity. And one of the ways to do that is just sitting down with family. The holidays is such a great opportunity to really sit with your family and find out, where did they come from? You'll be so surprised. And maybe you'll have a great grandparent that was a Native American, or you'll have a grandparent that did come from the African continent or from South Africa or North Africa, and some India. But I think looking at genealogy, and there's so many great ways to do that. Another thing is within a diaspora, there is a separation of individuals too. So as you identify your diaspora, find out other divisions within that. So for example, I was born in Bombay, came from India, when I was very young. So I'm kind of in two diasporas where I'm sort of Americanized, but I'm Indian because I go back every year. But there's culture and tradition for me in both sides. There's Americanized Indians, they call them. There's actually a study of Indian culture called ABCD, American born confused Desi. Desi is the Indian word for Indians. So there's a diaspora within the diaspora. So I think, get to know the divisions within your own diaspora is a great thing to do during the holiday season.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gentry and Dr. Punjabi. So on to our second question. So since both diaspora and ethnic group relatively mean the same thing, why is there an emphasis on separating the two? This is for Dr. Gentry.
Thank you. That's a good question, and it's especially good question this year since this is actually a census year in the United States. Of course, we have our census every 10 years. It's the decennial count of the United States population. It's in our Constitution that this is how we are going to determine representation in Congress. So the number of seats that we might have in the House of Representatives is determined by the count of the population within each state's borders. And it's important to note that the 14th Amendment of the Constitution does state that non-citizens also count in the census. And so, without getting too much into the weeds about the terminology that's used in demographics, one of the categories that we tend to think of, and of course this series is related to that term of race. And in our first conscious conversation, we talked about the myths of race and racial stereotypes. And so these are social constructions. They're terms that we've made up to categorize people based on appearance and cultural practices, but they don't actually have biological meaning or value in reality. They are more cultural markers. And so when we think of race and the census, we have Caucasians or the white race, African Americans or the black race, and then you have an ethnicity of Hispanic or Latinos, and that's the only actual ethnicity that's included on the U.S. Census. And of course, that's related to the fact that people can be of Hispanic heritage. And so that's, again, a cultural marker that's delineated differently than race. And so when we start to talk about diaspora, we're mostly talking about this idea of culture and geography. Where are you from? What were your traditions or practices, and who are you connected to or related to? It's less of a social construct in terms of these imaginary ideas of race that are based on skin color or other biological markers that are really not fixed. And again, just to reiterate the point that in terms of race, we're all the same race. We're human beings, Homo sapiens, and so we're all the same species. But within the species, we have different geographical origins, and so we might say that diaspora is based on geography, and then here in the United States, we've gone a little bit further to say that this Hispanic heritage has to do with language. That's one cultural practice that's associated with it. And we have yet to really complicate this idea of ethnicity and the census beyond the Hispanic identity, but we know that there are other ways of thinking about ethnicities beyond just the census term for it. So that's one way to think about it, is just in terms of how we look at it on the census and on forms that have to do with the government. We can talk a little bit more about that with some of the other questions, but I don't want to get too complicated into terminology that's used on the census. So just for now, let's leave it at that to say that ethnicity is a category that's included in addition to race when we're looking at the census. And when we think of diaspora, we're thinking of origins in terms of geography and cultural practices.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gentry. And then for Dr. Punjabi, in context to your last comments about the subsections within diasporas, how does this idea of diaspora affect the feeling of belonging or discrimination in people who are a part of these groups or not a part of these subgroups?
I think one of the things that's changing in our world, and this term diaspora, I think it really is becoming more and more about identity. So when you ask about the separation, and I'm sorry, Avi, I was so caught up in your question. Ask that question, that last part again, please.
How does this feeling or belonging or discrimination in people who are a part of these types of groups or these subgroups, how does that affect them?
Okay, great. So a diaspora can be used because it's about identity. It can be used to create a feeling of inclusion for identity, but can also be used to feel separate. I really believe that what we identify ourselves as is more and more a choice. So I was the first Indian in my little subculture in South Texas to marry a non-Indian. And when I had my children, the nurse said, well, the father is Hispanic and you're Asian, so what ethnicity do you identify the children? And I said proudly, they're Hispasian. And I call them my Hispasian children. And it's a choice every day, and it becomes a conversation. I speak both Hindi, which is now also called Urdu, and I speak really good Spanish. So it really is a matter of choice. And the same thing goes with, can a diaspora give us identity or can it separate us? I really think it's how you look at it. And that's why it's so important to do some research about your family tree and notice what you have in common with your grandmother or your great grandfather, who may be, like I said, Native American or may have come from Caribbean descent, a lot like what's happening with our vice president. I believe she's she's half Indian, and is she Trinidad? Is that it? I'm so outside of the news.
Her father was from Jamaica.
Jamaica. Thank you, Dr. Gentry. But what is she? And she identifies herself, I believe, as an American. I'd love to see an interview what she identifies herself as. But I hope that answered that question. I think it's really a choice.
If I could say a little bit more on that question, and I'll connect it to the previous question as well, since I was talking about Latina identity as an ethnic identity. When we think about how the majority of the Mexican American and Latina population came to be in the United States, it came through annexation of states like Texas, Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and that was Mexico. That was territory that was actually part of the Mexican nation state. And as a result of the war between Mexico and the United States, first beginning with the war of Texas and California against Mexico, you had involuntary diaspora, where people didn't actually migrate. The border crossed them. They didn't cross the border. They became, migrants due to the national border shifting. And so they were subjected to a racialized discrimination that, was based on skin color, but also language, because they predominantly spoke Spanish, and they could be, segregated in schools based on that. And so these types of policies and practices and experiences of discrimination that had been experienced by a majority of African-American immigrants was also experienced by folks who had Latin American roots and Caribbean roots as well. And so there's a way in which, this discrimination and treatment based on identity and ethnicity has its historical roots, but it has carried over to the present day. And so, any migrants coming from Central or South America sort of get lumped together and seen in the same way, whether they are legal migrants or illegal migrants. All these terms get conflated and confusing. And so, we really do have to look at people for their individual stories and their individual family histories and heritage to really understand them, and not just try to lump people together, even if they do have that shared history and practices. As Dr. Punjabi said, it is a choice to be a part of it, but there can also be this sort of involuntary imposition of an identity where people have to deal with that kind of discrimination.
Thank you, Dr. Punjabi and Dr. Gentry. Our next question is, what is the difference between victim and labor diasporas? And how do they both have a harmful history and the reasons for migration?
Well, if we look at the three examples that I brought up earlier about the Russian Jewish diaspora, if we think about World War II and the Holocaust in Europe and the atrocities that were committed and the need for people to seek asylum elsewhere, that's one example of a victim diaspora. You also have the African-American slave experience, the transatlantic slave trade that brought many African Americans in chains against their will across the Atlantic Ocean, shoved in ships. And there's a sense of real trauma that's not only experienced by those individuals who experience that treatment firsthand, but there's a legacy of that trauma that we know is sort of passed on through genes, what's an epigenetic kind of trauma that people have experienced. But more recent arrivals, whether we think about the migration from the south to the north in the Americas, or from the east to the west in terms of the Indian subcontinent and other South Asian nations that are arriving in the United States due to a lack of economic opportunities in the homeland and unique educational opportunities available here in the United States. Those skilled workers are prized individuals. They're very much favored and valued in the US workforce and in the marketplace. And so that's a way in which we can look at a labor-based diasporic movement. When we look at those arrows on the map, a lot of those recent arrivals are coming with college educations, with very specific skills that are needed in the US job market. And they are able to fill those jobs and form their communities here and build up a new sense of identity and unity. And it becomes a choice. If we think about the South Asian diaspora as a newer diaspora in the United States, at the very least, we can say that they don't always have to integrate or assimilate into the culture into which they arrive. Culturally, linguistically, religiously, or politically, they can choose, how they want to engage or not, but they don't just have to simply assimilate. And these are very porous borders. People come and go, they send money back and forth. But we do have, examples like Kamala Harris and her mother, who was an active member of the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century. And that's how she met her husband and Kamala Harris's father. They met, joining forces politically. And now we have, this example of the coming together of those worlds and the incoming vice president.
There's a really interesting labor diaspora also that's coming up in India, and I'm going to try and say it right. It's coolitization. I remember being in India, and we would call the guys that would help, because I was sort of considered Americanized. And so when I got to India, we had the coolies. The coolies were the laborers, the people that helped us, you know, unload our cars, do things around the house. And now it's called coolitization. And it's kind of I'm learning about this, and it's where we put the word cool, which is kind of like really calm, from Gandhi's tradition, and coolitization, which means giving voice to the downcast. Or, you know, in India we have the caste system, and unfortunately we say it's not there, but it's kind of still there, unhidden, undiscussed. But so that's a new labor diaspora. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Dr. Gentry. I'm learning about it.
And then
that term is new to me. I'll just say one more thing where, you know, again, modern migrations complicate where different groups fit into, you know, one diaspora or another. And so whereas we think of African Americans who arrived before the abolition of slavery and the Civil War in the United States, which ended slavery in the South as well, you know, that was the primary way in which African descended people arrived in the United States prior to the 20th century. Since the beginning of the 20th century, it's been primarily Caribbean and eventually African migrants. And so beginning in the 1950s is when we got a really large you know, influx of new African migrants to the United States. And one reason is because of the invention of the airplane and the modern commercial air flights being able to happen. But one way in which those modern airplanes were used was to actually bring students over. And so just a quick story about how Barack Obama became our first African-American president of the United States. It would not have happened if his father had not been brought to the United States as part of what's known as the African airlift. And in the late 1950s, there was a group of some 80 or so African students from places like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, who were actually flown to the United States. And they attended schools like Howard University in Washington, D.C., Michigan State University in Lansing, Michigan, and the University of Hawaii. And that's where Barack Obama Sr. attended school. And he had his airfare and his tuition covered through a fundraising effort to bring those African students here so that they could learn skills and then take them back to help develop their homelands. And so that's another way of thinking about labor diaspora that's really about education, access to education, and then taking that, you know, that knowledge and those skills back to the homeland. And that's what Barack Obama's father did, but Barack Obama stayed in the United States with his mother, and the rest is history. And so that's another way to think about, you know, the formation of diasporas. It's not just a job, but it also might be obtaining and acquiring the skills to get a job that may, you know, keep you here, or it may take you back to the homeland to help develop and rebuild there.
And for our final question, Dr. Punjabi, this one is based off of your experience, or rather how you were discussing this Americanization, or this question of how people like me who are second generation immigrants are neither like here nor there, one can say. So people may hear the phrases, you aren't really Mexican, Black, Indian, Asian, etc., because it doesn't necessarily fit their standard, what they believe X or Y looks like. And why is there a standard for these forms of diasporas?
I think it's human to try and put people in a box. And so, you know, when we're in school or with a group of friends, they might say, you're really not this or that. My nieces, so my brother, who was born in India, of course, with me, married a girl from California, and my nieces went to a local school and didn't really feel Indian. didn't really feel of European descent, and they were kind of not included in the diaspora of non-Indians or Indians. And, I don't think it was always easy, but I'm really proud of them because they found their way. And actually, in an essay, one of them wrote something wonderful about how taking the best of her two cultures and who she is today. So I think as we go, and history shows that we're all human beings, and we're going to have children of different races coming together. I think that hopefully people will stop putting others in a box, and you're not really this, you're not really that. It's just human beings afraid that they don't know what to say or how to act. It's really their own insecurities. So what I would do, if you are being told something like that in your school environment, please talk to someone of your diaspora, or talk to someone of the diaspora that you're supposed to not be, or that you are be, and break those barriers, get those questions answered, and relate to other human beings. And I think you'll find that it really doesn't matter whether you're this or that or how you act. It's really being you.
Thank you, Dr. Punjabi. And if we could now have a topic conclusion, that would be great.
I think that, and Dr. Gentry said it, that traditions are traveling. I love that. It was really great. And what that means to me is that, learn about other diasporas, learn about your own diaspora within that, and break those barriers. I know that in the Hispanic diaspora, so there's Latino, there's Hispanic, there's the Mexican. So you might find those separations just in how we identify ourselves. Well, break those barriers and go find someone in your diaspora that's different, that identifies themselves within or a different diaspora, and break those bonds, those barriers. And I also think celebrating the accomplishment of the people in your diaspora. Know about the Indians, if you're Indian or Middle Eastern, that are breaking records and that are changing history. Know more about that. I think that's really important, a great way to kind of end this evening.
Wow, that was wonderful. Dr. Punjabi, Dr. Gentry, we so appreciate your input that you shared with us tonight here at SACAM and the webinar audience. And I think we can all bring from this that we are all human beings, and that we probably have a lot more in common than we think. So I would like to leave you tonight with that thought. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Punjabi, Dr. Gentry, our hosts, Avery Neal and Abhived Pulapaka, both from RaceEd. I'd like to thank our SACAM board, our staff, our interns, volunteers, and you, the attendee. And also I'd like to thank Google Fiber for bringing this to fruition this evening.